Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. I'm Victoria Dangle, the Executive Director of the General Society. For those of you not familiar with the organization, it was founded in 1785 by 22 tradesmen, and they represented carpenters, at that initial meeting, carpenters, saddlers, tailors, and silversmiths, among others. Today, our 230-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our Tuition-Free Mechanics Institute, our library, which you are in tonight, founded in 1820, and our nearly 2-century-old lecture series, of which the Artisan series is a part. As I said, the library you're in tonight, it's the second oldest library in New York City and one of 3 remaining membership circulating libraries in New York City. And the book and periodical collections go back to 1785, and they are suited to both recreational and scholarly reading. And I want to invite you to join the library for as little as $35. And this program, I'd also like to thank the New York Landmarks Conservancy, our partner in presenting the Artisan Lecture Series this evening. And we would also like to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, as well as the generous support of the McQuestion Companies, Peter Panoia Architects, and Bauer and Dean Publishers, and the Friends of the Artisan Lecture Series. A warm welcome to all of you. And now I will ask our program director, Karen Taylor, to introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Good evening. As Victoria said, welcome to the Artisan Lecture Series. The Artisan Lecture Series promotes the work and art of skilled craftsmen to insist in ensuring that their unique knowledge is understood and carried forth for generations. This evening, we are so fortunate to have someone whose company celebrates the art of craftsmanship, working closely with many artisans. Before I tell you a little bit about our speaker this evening, I just wanted to draw your attention to, some of you may have noticed these on the front table. This is a map of the buildings that EverGreene Architectural Arts has touched, conserved, restored throughout New York City, so you might be interested in picking this up afterwards. There's also a brochure on the company. Over the last 3 decades, Jeff Greene, president and founder of EverGreene Architectural Arts, has led large-scale interior conservation, restoration, and new design work for significant spaces in every historic architectural style. He has revived artistic and decorative techniques by learning from master craftsmen in the United States and abroad, and applying his knowledge and experience coast to coast. Mr. Greene is considered to be one of the country's most foremost experts in both traditional and innovative techniques for murals, ornamental plaster, and decorative finishes. He is a professional associate of the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works and has served on the boards of numerous organizations, including the National Society of Mural Painters, the League of Historic American Theaters, and the Association for Preservation Technology. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Jeff Greene, who very appropriately will be discussing this evening the beauty in the details.
Thank you all for coming out on this evening. I'm going to hold forth for a little bit on the things that interest me and the questions that I've had in my 40-year career pursuing what is beautiful in architecture and what underlies it. So I'm going to basically cover the history of art and all mankind in 40 minutes. So hold on to your seats, and hopefully it will be of interest to you. It's something that I've really sort of loved studying for basically my entire life. Is it working? There we go. So seeing. The eyes are the principal organ of perception. And we can learn to see more, and we're bombarded all the time by sensory data. You know, there were sort of fed impressions all the time. And interestingly enough, the word aesthetics, the etymology is from the Greek aesthesis, which is the sensation of perception of the senses, feeling and seeing. So this is at the root of ornament and decoration. I mean, I think it starts with the heartbeat, mankind's, you know, this regular pulse of our heart beating and our desire to find order in the world and meaning in the built environment. And I'm going to bounce all over the place. I'm not going to do it necessarily in chronological order, but I'm also going to talk about the collaboration between architects and artists. This is the Rothko Chapel in Houston, 1971, Mark Rothko and Philip Johnson. And I don't know if any of you have been to this place or not, but it's remarkable. I don't know, it doesn't come across in the photographs, but when you go in here, you feel something. And people all various religions have deposited their books here. It's a place where people go and meditate. And standing in front of these paintings, I ask myself, what did he understand? And there's, you know, there's something in these paintings which is, and in the space itself, the environment they create, which is at the heart of what I do as a architectural artist, and we do as a company, to look for what is that quality, what is that, and I think that the artist's job is to express the ineffable, to express what can't be seen, which is, you know, also what the purpose of some religion is for as well. So these paintings are very spiritual, and I think at the root of it, that's where it all comes from, this sort of magic. And so this was the cover of the current Smithsonian magazine. It's the Lascaux Caves in France, and which are replicas that try to capture the spirit of that mysterious place. I think you all are familiar with the Lascaux Caves as well, which are also only available as a replica now. And having been to some of these caves and been to the real ones, Peshmerel and Font de Gaume, and seen them, and there's some remarkable things there that, you know, this meaning, this power that these places have seems to be something that is transferred through time and passes down to us. So it still holds some meaning. It still holds relevancy. And looking at it, one of the remarkable things, especially at Peshmerel, there are marks made on the wall there from 25,000 years, and then the same marks are made 10,000 years later. And to me, that's just remarkable. I mean, how time has changed, but those caves, they were, as human beings, we're all human beings, we're all, as I said, subject to the same impressions and the translation of those impressions. But here's a little chart I made up showing, you know, the caves, and by the way, there's similar caves are painted in Australia, India, Indonesia, Africa, from 40,000 years to probably 15,000 years BC, and actually earlier than that as well, or later than that, I guess you'd say. So that's an enormous duration of time. And then ancient Egypt, 3,000 to 300 BC. So just use these little dots. And then, so we're at a time now where there's all this transition and things are changing much, much faster. So the meaning that we have, if you look at you know, this little chart that I put together, you know, we have things that change in our lifetime, in 10 years' time, in 5 years' time. Taste change, the meaning changes, styles change. And, but what I'm interested in, and I hope this interests you as well, is what's at the core of these things. Where's, you know, that, so that a great work of art, a great piece of architecture, a space that moves you, something hasn't changed. It translates through all these times. We still relate to it in some way. What is the essence of that? And that's a quest that I've been on my life. I do not have an answer. If someone else knows the answer to that question, please tell us. All right, but that's what interests me. And I believe that there is some universality of ornament and through craft and through beauty. Everyone recognizes when something is done well. The quality of craftsmanship is something that transcends styles and ornament. But I have a few examples here, and I'll just give them how the metamorphosis of meaning through time. The Egyptian example, as I said, 3,000 years ago roughly, then had a huge influence. Napoleon, 1801, brought back the images to Europe, which inspired the Empire movement, which inspired the Biedermeier movement in the 1840s, which inspired Borromese art, Benedictine art in the 1880s, which in turn inspired a Viennese secession school, Otto Wagner, Gustav Klimt, Koloman Moser, that evolved into Adolf Loos in 1915, and ultimately the seeds of modernism can be found in Egyptian art and its influence in the West, which is to me just incredibly fascinating to see this red thread and its evolution. And I'm not going to go too much into art history here, but similarly, and I'll give some examples of this, the Domus Aureus, which was Nero's pleasure palace, which was destroyed in 64 AD, and then Raphael and his contemporaries in the Italian Renaissance rediscovered it in the 14 and 1500s, and they would lower themselves down on ropes into the grottos. Hence, the grotesques is a type of style that you see in the Vatican and the Villa Madama, which was based largely on the Domus Aureus. Again, popularized in the 1700s by the lithographies of Miri, and the Adams brothers revived it again in the 1760s and through the 1790s, and then again in the American Revolution, in the American Renaissance in the 1890s, and then at Sherry Netherland, a project here in New York, which I'll show you, which is a direct derivation, but at very different meanings. So to me, it's kind of fascinating how these things have evolved. And I think the notion of making things with one's hands, it's interesting, the word poetry comes from the Greek poesis, which is the skill to make things. And one looks at these African masks, which some African masks are just made for tourists, but others of them seem to hold great power. And how is that this simple object, some of them can hold enormous power and meaning for the people, and some of them are just, they don't have the same quality. And how do we discern that? How do we recognize it? How does it translate? And how do we apply it to the architecture that we live in and the environment all around us? How do we see that? So there's many different ways of translating information, emotionally, informationally. We can look at it as vernacular or high art. The example on your left is from 1970s. It's not ancient art. That's a ceremonial house in Papua New Guinea. And on the other side is the Kansas State Capitol from the 1870s. And I'll get more into the examples of projects that we've worked on. And I have to say that the wonderful thing of working on all these marvelous projects is that we get to see the hands of the craftsmen who came before us with their analog mind, their supreme common sense, and their ability to translate ideas into architecture that we work on. So we're not only preserving the architecture, but we're preserving the craft of the architecture or the art and the ornament in it. And of course, if ornament is a language, and I'll just use this metaphor, is there a common grammar? What are the structural principles? What's the syntax? Are there a hierarchy of forms? What are the formalistic principles? Texture, pattern, composition, rhythm, scale. These are the building blocks. And so when we look at a project and we try to understand a project, a contemporary project, I think these same principles underlie all of the various examples. Of course, our language is derived from the Western classical tradition. This is the Parthenon, 438 BC. And these same forms, even in this building, you can look at the capitals and the forms of the architecture here are derived directly from these Greek and Roman precedents. So now to talk a little bit about some projects that we're working on and how these these are just some big ideas to set the stage, and then I'll try to go into some case studies of what we've been able to see and how the projects we've worked on and our working methods. This is a project we're involved with right now. We've been involved at the Park Armory for, 5 or 7 years, something like that. But the current project is the Veterans Room here by Louis Comfort Tiffany, and they discovered behind a painting a fragment of wall covering by Tiffany that looked like it had been printed on elephant skin, and no one knew exactly how the technique was done. And we figured it out, and we're working with Herzog and Demiran to interpret and adapt that as a modern interpretation of the Tiffany interiors, this pattern. So the Industrial Revolution, just again a little bit more history here, had an enormous impact on the way we perceive things. Chroma lithography was patented in 1837, and all these pattern books came out in the middle to the latter part of the last century, the 19th century. Books by Owen Jones, Racinet, Encyclopedia of Ornament, Audsley Brothers in Scotland, Dolmisch in Germany, Dresser in England, Speltz and Myers in Germany as well. And they disseminated patterns from around the world in different styles. So here's just some examples. But they also did one other thing. The Chroma lithography had an enormous influence on the way we perceive color. So if you look at artists' palettes before that, they worked predominantly with earth colors. But this is Pugin and his neo-Gothic revivals of the 1880s, huge influence on arts and crafts, William Morris and William Ruskin. But the Impressionists, starting in the mid-1800s, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, changed their color palette largely because of both the influence of color lithography, but also the invention of new types of pigments. Cadmium was synthesized in the 1840s. Synthetic ultramarine didn't need to be made from lapis lazuli. It could be made synthetically starting in the 1830s. And that brings us to the science that we're involved with as conservators on these buildings. So what do, EverGreene? We try to combine art, construction, and science, and craft, of course, in many different ways. We bring all these disciplines to bear, this kind of cross-pollinary approach to the built environment. Here's some of our craftsmen working on the King Street Station in 1906 in Seattle, Washington. But here's a wonderful case story. This is the Grace Church, Upjohn, 1844 built. The interior was painted in 1866. So there's a black and white photograph. One can never trust black and white photographs because of the color temperature of the film. Different colors will shift. Reds and blues might appear as either dark or light. But it gives you some idea that there was these enormous rich patterns there. As we began to go back and investigate, so this is what it looked like when we were given it. It was all painted white, and the ceiling was wood grained. What do? We look at it, chips under the microscope in cross-section. Here's our chromochronology, our layer structure. We look at the wood to understand it in cross-section as well. We look at it under the microscope, we analyze it. But in this particular project, we started to go up on the ceiling and do little cleaning tests, and the distemper paint made from glue, water-based paint, in the 1860s and later, mostly in churches, but in other buildings as well, you couldn't go to the store and buy a can of paint. The painters made their own paint. They mixed up earth pigments with glue size, and they heated it on right there on the job site and painted the buildings. So we started to wash it off, and lo and behold, the wood graining washes off and reveals the 1868 original painting on the ceiling. And all we had to do to conserve this was just wash the ceiling and get right back to the 1868 paint. But the walls were a little trickier. They'd all been overpainted. We did what we call exposure windows, where we reduce the paint, we take off one layer of paint at a time, discover what the patterns were underneath it till we find the target layer, in this case 1868. And then we made a rendering, and the people in Brooklyn, the Grace Church, well, we don't know if we like that. It's so old-fashioned. And what we discovered was this is the only intact Pugin-inspired interior in America. And the patterns that we found were derived directly from the Pugin pattern books that I'd shown earlier. And so we made this watercolor rendering showing what it could look like, but we discovered something else as we put all these patterns together, that the poetic metaphor for the entire interior was the Garden of Eden. And so the pattern on the wall here, it's a little hard to see in that photograph, is a sprouted seed as a Christian cross. And so there's this rich symbolism in all of these details, and then all the details conspire to create this richly decorated interior that the church said, well, we're not sure if we like it. So we had to do it little by little to get them accustomed to, and I said, well, you can have an absolutely ordinary church just like every other one, or we can do something that is unique in all of the United States. And fortunately, ultimately, they went with the latter. And here we are doing some of the pieces in the studio on canvas, and here is the finished church. And it's quite the transformation. It's absolutely beautiful. So one of the things that was happening in the 1890s, and that's important to keep in mind, is the American Renaissance. This is the 1893 Columbian Exposition, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it. It was a kind of repudiation of the Victorian revival and all these different styles, and a return to classicism. And mistakenly, the buildings that were at the Columbian Exposition were all whitewashed, and when you go into white rooms now, a lot of it came from this period where they did not realize that originally the Parthenon was a polychromed building, and subsequently they've gone back and found tiny pigments in the crevices, and they realized it was a richly polychrome building. But so our white rooms came from the American Renaissance. These are Daniel Burnham's plans, the Macmillan Plan, 1901, the 1903 Burnham Plan for the Cleveland Civic Center, McKim Mead and White's Lowe's Library at Columbia, and a project that we were involved with. This one, which was the Postal Square, 1911, and believe it or not, they had put not a drop ceiling, a concrete floor in at this level, and destroyed all of this coffer work. And we went back and found fragments of it up behind the drop ceiling, and were able to replicate it and create the full height space as it originally looked. Here's another project that we worked on in Washington. But I want to talk about the collaboration of artist and architect, which created all this wonderful, extraordinary architecture. And I think each one brings a different sensibility. The architect thinks about space and volume and how people use the building, and the artist thinks about the things that we're taught, how images work, how patterns work, and how to adorn that space, which has somewhat fallen out of fashion, and it is also coming back. So this is Lafarge, 1913, St. Matthew's Cathedral, mosaics designed by Blashfield, and again, we richly patterned marble. We cleaned and restored virtually every inch of this cathedral over a 3-year period of time while it stayed open. Quite the task. Here's another project that I feel very fortunate to have worked on. This is the Jefferson building at the Thomas Jefferson building at the Library of Congress. Worked on this building from, I think, 88 to the early 90s, about 5 years of my life. And there are artists here, Kenyon Cox, Blashfield, the entire, there's all the best artists in America were on this project. It was 1897, and at a time when the idea of civitas, enlivening the spirit, we were Manifest Destiny, we'd gone to the West Coast and we were on our way back, and then on the East Coast here, they were looking to Europe for these historic precedents, and the entire thing was organized by Elmer Garnsey, who's one of my sort of heroes that I look to and emulate and try to understand what his role was. But it was very common that all of these artists worked together in consort, all in one building. Similarly, at the Essex County Courthouse, again, Cass Gilbert. We worked on this building for a number of years. Here's one of the interiors, again, murals by Cass Gilbert was the architect, Lewis Company Tiffany, Blashfield, Kenyon Cox, Charles Turner, William Lowe, Howard Pyle, and again, all organized by Elmer Garnsey. And there were representations of the common values and the aspirations of this sort of new America at the turn of the century, the American Renaissance. Now, what did we do? These are the conditions that we encountered. There were, you can see here, those are fly specks, or the excretions of insects on the faces of the murals, and other problems with delaminated canvases and water intrusions. Some of the areas were in extremely bad shape. They really let it get that bad. This is our replica of what we had to put back. So we conserved what we could, cleaned what we couldn't, cleaned everything and replicated what we couldn't. And here's an image of the finished interior, really. And I mean, we know what goes on in these courthouses now, but the idea was that they would enliven the human spirit, and that you would, in all of these spaces, I think you're meant to feel something, you're meant to be transported, you're meant to have some psychological effect when you enter the space. And even color can have this effect. If you carefully modulate the color, you walk into a space, you feel something. And that's what we're trying to do. The question is, what is the meaning, what is the content? All of these, this language is meant to express something, to tell a story, to, whether it's through symbols or through, some enter you and affect you in some other way besides your intellect. So here's another project that we worked on. This is another thing from the New York Times, where they're talking about restoring lobbies of buildings. And the one on here is the Verizon building, Ralph Walker, 1926. And which was badly damaged in 9/11. The back of the building was torn off and exposed to the weather for more than a year. These murals were badly degraded through that action. We restored them once, several years later, and then again when Sandy hit in 2012 and the Hudson River overflowed, this lobby was flooded, and we came back and restored them yet again. And then this is another project, the Sherry Netherland up on Central Park, at 59th or 60th Street, 1927, Schultz and Weaver, with murals. The original lobby looked like this. Joseph Arruda was the original artist, and for some reason in the 1960s, they painted it all out and basically forgot about it. And we did a little exposure window here, and there was a face peering back at us, all right? So we went in and did a little bit more testing and found out how to remove layer by layer by layer to return to the original. This was all lead-based paint. We had to do this while they stayed open. We created a negative airspace. You can see our people working with their masks on so they could not be affected by the solvents or the lead, and basically sealed it off, negative air containment, so that the people could continue to use the lobby. And these murals are based directly on those earlier precedents I showed you of the Domus Aureus in Rome, and the subsequent reinterpretation of that by Raphael at the Vatican corridors in the grotesques, what they call the Vatican grotesques. So that's what this was based on. And there it is, finished, filled with people. This is another project which we've been very fortunate to be involved with, the King's Theater in Brooklyn, which just opened in, I think February, beginning of February, Rap and Rap, 1929. Closed in 1974, so that means it was closed for 41 years. And it was in horrendous shape. The balconies had basically melted off. There were murals on these walls that were gone. We went in, we did the paint analysis, we looked at it under the microscope, we discovered what the original finishes were, did a plaster survey, determined that what of the plaster could be salvaged, what had to be replaced. That needed to be replaced, we had to sculpt it from clay, make new models, make new molds, and recast it. Here we are rebuilding the fascias of the balconies. I had to put in all new steel work to support it. We use modern methods, but again, the same traditional craft. Here we are painting it and decorating it as per the original findings of our under the microscope. Here's a few more pictures. That gives you some sense of what it was like up on that ceiling, on the dance floor, we call it, the scaffolding that was put up there. And here's a little before and after. And you can see literally the holes in the ceiling. And one more after picture. So, and you should all visit there, and it's a wonderful, entertainment space now. It holds 3,200 people, and it's just marvelous. And again, the idea of this space, going back to the original theme of, how does a space transport you to another time and place? When this was built, it was meant to look old, and the immigrants who were living in Brooklyn at the time who were using it, mostly from Europe, would go in here. They were workers, factory workers. They'd go into a movie theater in 1929 and during the Depression and be transported to this fantasy world where, and they say this was based on Versailles and the Paris Opera House very loosely. Wrap and Wrap was basically fantasy architecture, but it was meant to look old the day it opened, and the people who used it to see the movies were transported to another place. It was, and that was the idea. Here's another Brooklyn project. This is St. Joseph's Co-Cathedral, Francis Berlinbach, 1912, designated as a cathedral in 2012. These were the conditions that we encountered when we got there. We did a paint analysis, but we didn't find much. It was a parish church. It had never been decorated. It had dwindled down to a parish of about 80 people, literally 80 people meeting in the basement. And they had sold off the convent next door, and the real estate being what it is now in Brooklyn, they were able to renovate it and turn it into the Co-Cathedral. So here we are cleaning the murals, adding decoration to the walls. The large expanses of walls needed to be broken up by texture, and a lot of the texture and the pattern, what it does is it humanizes the environment, humanizes the architecture, and allows human scale and people to enter the architecture. Even though it might be monumental architecture, it allows one to participate in that architecture. And then we were commissioned to create new murals there of the American saints. So this is our process of a little black and white sketch, larger sketch, and then the maquette. And then ultimately, in our studio, we stretch the canvas, and you can see the sequence of laying it out and actually painting it. We also, and you can see the transformation of the space beforehand, our little sketch for the Flight Out of Egypt, and the finished murals, which were just installed on St. Joseph's Day a month ago, I guess. And then here is, now it looks like a cathedral. And one of the wonderful things about this project is that and it's a little hard to see in this photograph, but in the side aisles here, there are 24 murals of the Holy Mother, each denomination, and I believe that the Mass is given in Brooklyn in 43 different languages. So each of these different groups, Filipino, Czech, Polish, Irish, Dominican, Cuban, each of them had their depiction of the Virgin. And to my knowledge, there's no other place like this outside of Nazareth in Jerusalem, in Israel, in Palestine. So presumably this will become a pilgrimage site and a devotional site for the faithful. And there's a question in my mind when we work on these churches: how do we create a space or artwork that one wants to pray in front of? And to me, that's quite a powerful obligation or quest, if you will. How do you make a sacred space, which is, or whether it's sacred to a courthouse or a state capitol, or obviously when we have this common language in a church, there's certain symbols that are known, even though there's a great deal of symbolic illiteracy that we're, how do we, if you spoke Latin, how would you say, recite a poem in Latin? And a good example of this is, if you think about Chekhov, which was written in Russian, but the power of those words, the power of those plays translates into English. So how do we translate and evolve these different meanings for our times? Here's another project we were involved in, a more technical project. This was the Harlem Hospital, 1936, 1937. These were the only African-American muralists And there were complaints in the newspaper. I've read the accounts saying, why do we have all these Negroes painting murals in our hospital? And I'm repeating what was said, not my opinion, obviously, but it was controversial at the time, in Harlem, no less, you know. And so Alston, Crimmy, Hayes, and Seabrook, they painted these murals. They were allowed to degenerate to a large degree, and the hospital was to be torn down, but they wanted to save the WPA artwork. That was our charge. So we had to go in. Here's what it looked like when we were given the job, and put it back in the new building designed by HOK in 2012. But in order to do that, we had to cut out entire sections. We did this over a 3-year period of time. Some of them were actual frescoes on the walls, and we had to grout the walls, epoxy steel pins, create a sandwich to sandwich the wall in so as to hold the murals together, cut the entire wall out, cut holes in the floor, drop the murals through the building by a crane, cut holes in the outside of the building, pull the murals out on these forklifts, and then on the bottom, reinstall them. So it's a very challenging technological project. And so here's conservation employing engineering, science, and construction. And here they are reinstalled. And you can see us putting them back in. This is the condition. One of them was in the Seabrook mural. It had been painted over. We had to remove the overpaint, retrieve the mural underneath it, transfer it to another backing, and then reinstall it. And the wonderful thing was that they used the images from the murals on the exterior graphics as the poster child for the new museum. So this is the new hospital. This is the new hospital as it looks today in Harlem. Now, one more case study, and I'm going to go fast because we're running out of time. The Empire State Building, which was built finished in 1931, William Lamb, and we have one of the authors of this, of the history of this building with us tonight. And the ceiling on the right was 1963 for the World's Fair. They wanted to modernize it. So for 32 years, the murals on the ceiling here existed by Rambush. For 37 years, up until 2010, they were covered by this drop ceiling. We went back in above the drop ceiling. You can see us lying on our backs there. And we did exposure windows, but there was these very subtle layers of leaf and glazing. And what we discovered was that you may or may not know this, but dirt is held to a surface by a very weak electrical charge. And we discovered that this metallic leaf was holding this electrical charge, was holding the dirt on the ceiling in such a way that you could just make out the pattern. Of course, if you wiped your hand across it, it was gone, because it was just dirt sitting on the surface. So we very carefully traced all the dirt patterns on the ceiling, which is how we knew what the layout was. So sometimes conservation is not so high tech; it's very simple. All right, and there was asbestos involved, lead paint, and it was decided not to conserve the murals, but to replicate them. They were originally done on canvas, and we decided to put them back on canvas. And so here we are in the studio laying it out, and some of the artists who worked on it are in the audience today. And so I think it was 18,000 square foot of surface. Took us just a little over a year. And here they are reinstalling it, and here are the finished ceilings. I'm going to go really quick because I got about 5 minutes left, maybe 3 minutes. They'll let me go over a little bit. This is the Boston Opera House, 1932, which there was asbestos in the acoustic plaster. All the decoration had been removed in 1980, and our job was to basically rebuild this interior. We did it all digitally. I wanted to talk. Now I'm going to go into the future, bring us up to speed. So the majority of this was done. We took down the plaster ceiling, replicated it. They shrunk the building somewhat. We did our forensic analysis under the microscope. But the real discovery was that we looked at the catalog from the 1925 Exposition des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, where the word Art Deco comes from. And some 7 years later, the Paramount Theater chain directly plagiarized, excuse me, all the patterns from this exhibit in Paris and just used them freely. I guess there weren't copyrights back then. Just used them freely in their theater. So we used that as the replica to put back this theater digitally. Here's another example of digital printing. Encha Emeth, 1930, Alexander Merchant, a local architect, New Brunswick, New Jersey, middle of the Depression, never decorated, nothing historic to find. The congregation wanted to make it a more meaningful interior, and you can see that there's all kinds of things that don't work here. The cool colors on the cornice that should, I mean, if everyone knows this is a painter, cool colors should recede, they don't come forward. This is a complete misuse of color in architecture. And so here's what our designs look like based on, there was a computer program showing the reconstruction of the synagogues in Kristallnacht, and we took all the patterns from these European synagogues and applied them here. Now let's quickly move forward. Some of you might recognize this building, Villa Fillet, 1905, by an architect named Charles Edward Généré. Most of you know him as Le Corbusier. So even he understood ornament. He did this building when he was 17 years old, all right? And this is what, but he understood color and he understood pattern. So this is Unit de Habitation in Marseille, 1952, also Le Corbusier. Here's modern architecture using color, using pattern, using form. And here the decoration has to do with the size of the windows and the scale of the windows. And the colors are used to reflect light into the residences. Here's a building we're working on right now. The Getty has a worldwide initiative on modern architecture. We feel very fortunate that we were awarded the Getty grant to study the Eames House. The other projects were the Sydney Opera House, the modernist architecture in Tel Aviv, Saarinen building in Finland. I can't remember all the examples, but we're studying how the Eameses used commonly, this is right after the Second World War, this is 1949. And obviously they were friends with Joseph Albers and they understand Mondrian, but they were using off-the-shelf materials to build a residence housing for the returning GIs. And we're studying the materials they used and how those materials have aged and how we can preserve them. Now, here's a modern project that we worked on. This is a Washington Square residence for this fashion designer. The inspiration, she told us, was this dress that she designed. Here's our sketch for one of her ceilings in her apartment. Here's the models for our plaster, and there's the finished ceiling. And now getting right up to the moment, we're surrounded by street art, so graffiti, and its modern interpretation. Herzog and de Muren, 2007, 40 Bond Street for Ian Schrager, and modern uses of pattern based on the street art and graffiti. So now to get, we're almost there now. I appreciate all your patience. I hope I've kept everyone, I didn't see any heads nodding, so I guess people are still interested. So, you know, context. This is Jeff Koons, 2008. You know, taking what's these rubber, rendering them as stainless steel, putting them in Versailles. This juxtaposition of this richly ornate interior with this modern interpretation. So, what fascinates me is how we translate all these objects and their meaning in different contexts. And getting right up to the moment, neo-craftical. Of course, tomorrow, everyone knows, is the public offering of Etsy, which has 154 million members of people who make things with their hands. And Pinterest, the image depository, has 70,000 million users. This is Ray Eames's the toy sold by Sears in 1951. And here we come full circle with some of those images I showed in the beginning of where we started decorating our bodies before we started decorating our environment, sort of neo-tribal. But where is it all going? That is an image of your computer screen blown up. That's white on your computer screen, which is actually made from all these small dots. Now, in the past, pigments, what I work with, color, usually is seen through light from the sun coming through, hitting the pigments, bouncing back and reflecting, and then you see a color that's actually manufactured in your brain, not necessarily the physical properties of the color. But now we're perceiving color as backlit computer screens. And one wonders, in that, I'm going back to the beginning, how perception and the evolution of the way we see things and perceive things was very, very slow and had the same meaning for a long period of time. And one wonders how the computer screen and how you see it now, even if you go to Times Square around the corner and look at billboards, they're laid out like a computer screen. So it changes the way that we I believe, we're beginning to, another change, just like the Industrial Revolution, the example I gave before, of chroma lithography and modern pigments changing the way we perceive things. I think that we're going to have another evolution of the way we perceive things with the computers. And I love this because you're walking down the street holding your device and looking at a picture of you holding your device, and so one wonders what the future will hold. But I think, in conclusion, that if the impetus, which has, for human beings has existed from the beginning to humanize their environment or to, find order in the universe or find meaning in the universe, that that will stay true. And that is, in point of fact, what I look for in all of these wonderful buildings that I've looked on is, what was the meaning of that building? What were they trying to express? What did it feel like? And I think that impulse will not change, even if our means of expressing it change. So, thank you very much. And I almost finished on time. If anyone has any questions, go ahead.
Diagonally across from Penn Station on 7th Avenue, there is a billboard being projected on the side of a standard apartment building, and the billboard is about 7 or 8 stories high. But every once in a while, besides the ads, they project the original facade of the building onto the billboard. So, maybe we will end up with architecture that is not really there, but is projected there.
Well, if you think about curtain walls, which are no longer structures, right? So, why do we decorate? Why do, so we have these old precedents, these old archetypes, if you will, that sort of carry through, even though the column isn't needed anymore. It's not masonry structure. And if you look at actually, which is, and all this stuff fascinates me. I have the best job in the world because I get to, I love to look at these things and try to understand them. So if you look at any piece of architecture, that the dentils, for instance, on a building, everyone knows what a dentil is, right? So those were originally the rafters sticking through on, basically vernacular architecture, and that's no longer what it represents, but that the form continued on, or a beam form. So it'll be interesting to see how long these, as you say, it's just an image of what used to be there, but they still can contain meaning that we understand. And to me, that's what's really fascinating is, whether we understand it or not. I'll give you an example. We're working on a church right now, a temple actually, in Philadelphia, the Mormon temple. They're building a giant temple, kitty corner from the Catholic cathedral, kind of thumbing their nose at the old Catholic cathedral. But now the Mormon religion, first of all, is there anybody in the room who's Mormon? Any? Good. Okay, good. Then I don't have to be careful what I say. But So it's an American religion. It's only been around since the 1830s, 1840s, but they consider themselves an American religion. So they're building a building, and we were hired by the architects to detail all the plaster work. We were asked to look at federal style and buildings that, early American type of buildings, and get all that detailing exactly right. Because basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to push back their pedigree, psychologically in the building, so that people will look at them as being one of the founding religions of America, even though which is, but this is the power of architecture, to convey these subtle ideas that we're unaware of. But if you look at that building and you look at if we're successful, if you look at that building and you look at the other buildings in Philadelphia and see a commonality, you'll immediately think further back. So buildings have this incredible power to express ideas, both below the surface and kind of, above the surface, that we're conscious of. So to me, that's just fascinating. And that, the craftsmen who built these buildings, they understood not only the materials and how to get meaning from their hands, but, there was an underlying reason. And so to me, that's how that meaning changes and is reinterpreted in buildings, is the most wonderful part of my job, because I get to take them apart, literally, put them back together, try to understand what they were trying to say, how did they say it, what was the intent, and so it's this ongoing education. Every building that I work on, I get to learn something new with. So, any more questions? Yes.
Is there an educational and training component to your organization?
Not to my organization, but there are several schools in the United States that teach these things, and the Institute for Classical Architecture has programs where they teach, for instance, the vocabulary of moldings, as an example, plaster, and they have different programs. The what's it called? The College of the Building Arts in Charleston, Carolina, has a program, an actual, credited program. So there are places where these things are being taught, and they weren't for a long time. I mean, when I went to school, people weren't interested in how to draw the acanthus sleeve and why the acanthus sleeve, right, and what the proportions were and what it represented, and so there's a renewed interest, absolutely.
Can you describe in more detail the process you went through in transforming the synagogue from cool color to warm color, the cool to warm color approach?
Well, in painting, there's a principle that you have many things. You have atmospheric perspective, so that colors change at a distance, which is why you use some colors in architecture and other colors not, because they change at a distance. But in painting, there's a simple principle that warm colors come forward in general, cool colors recede. So in architecture, it makes sense to use cool colors, and you can always break these rules, but at least you have to understand what they are, in recesses, so that they go back. And now that rule can be, the contrast of colors or the contrast of value is actually a greater determinant of how to make architecture come forward or go back. And a lot of what one does in architecture, one of the ways that one can use color in architecture, is to strengthen what's already there. So you can emphasize the structure, or you can actually paint in the shadows, the chiaroscuro, to accentuate the volumes of the space. I mean, I'm speaking in very general terms, but that's the idea is the same principles that you use in painting. Soft edges recede and turn, sharp contrast comes forward. There's all these principles that one learns as a painter that can be applied to architecture, and they all hold true, and as well as ethnographic objects, the same principles apply whether it's Chinese architecture or Indian architecture or Mayan architecture. They still hold true for all cases. And so for me, trying to understand what those underlying principles are, which is probably more than a lifetime study. I don't expect that I'll, I'm just scratching the surface, especially because for our times, this is a language which isn't spoken. It's like, having a conversation with you in Latin. It's, I'm not, we're inarticulate. We're not conversant in it. I mean, the craftsmen who worked on these buildings that we get to work on, it was like writing their name to do what they did. I mean, they just did it, effortlessly and with great, ease and beautifully. I mean, just, the quality of their brushwork, that kind of thing. Does that answer your question? Or help at least?
Yes, it does. But I was also wondering if there were antecedents and roots, previous examples that you drew from that led you to the decisions that you took. It's a wonderfully worked out solution, and it seemed to have sprung from nowhere, but it clearly didn't. And I just wondered if there were some clearly formulated root forms that you drew from, or was it, as you just described, the result of a careful analysis?
I think, there's a woman, I'm going to answer your question indirectly. There's a teacher at Harvard, she actually teaches teaching, and she requires her students to go and spend, I think it's 3 hours, it's not an hour, I think it's 3 or 4 hours sitting in front of a work of art, a painting or a sculpture, and doing nothing, no electronic, digital, anything, just stand in front of a painting for 3 to 4 hours and look. And something takes place in that process. You begin to see more and more and more and more. And I think when you work on buildings and you study them, and so it's really just a process of seeing more, and hopefully if anything comes from tonight's talk, it's to inspire everyone in this audience to look more closely at what's around them, because I think it's just a question of seeing the experience of seeing and, perhaps sensing what's around you. So I think it's not necessarily an intellectual discovery, it's there already. It just needs to be understood and cognized, seen.
I've always been fascinated by the golden ratio, and I wondered whether a really successful building or a really successful artwork is in some way dependent as much as ever upon mathematics as anything else.
Well, there's something very interesting, and I think at the heart, and now we'll get a little, get into maybe some other realm. I mean, what I've been speaking about so far is just based on my own experience as, a human being and what we, how human beings think or perceive the world. But in nature, there are all kinds of, ratios, Fibonaccian series, the golden mean, and if man wants to understand his place in the universe, all right, which is, a pretty big undertaking, I suppose, right? By our experience in, how we live and what we see, one might understand, and I don't know how to do it. This is a bigger subject, right? But a fascinating one. So if there is an order, as scientists who look at quarks and little particles and things like that, there's something common to all of this. All right, so the same mathematical ratios exist in nature. The nautilus shell, the sunflower. If you look at dynarhythmic design, Arabic architecture, Persian architecture, and how they extrapolated a dynarhythmic pattern, those same things can be, so these are all mathematical proportions. Zellage in the inlaid tile of Morocco, those types of things are both a function of our mathematical mind, but I think ultimately have their source in nature and in man's understanding of, sort of what the principles of the universe are. But that's sort of a whole other dimension, right? Which also fascinates me. I've been fascinated by dynarhythmic design, but that's a whole other subject, you know, for another lecture, all right? Anybody else? Anyway, thank you all for coming.
Excuse me just one moment. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much for such a fabulous presentation. It was absolutely terrific, thought-provoking, beautiful, and I think we're also, I've said this at other lectures, we're so fortunate being here in New York City because we'll be able to go and see some of the buildings that you have transformed in situ. So I just want to thank you on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen for speaking here this evening. We were delighted to have you, and to, in memory of this, would like to make a presentation. This is again Victoria.
Yes, and to you, Jeff Greene, we present this plaque for your participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we have your library card. We've made you an honorary member of the library.
I love books.
So, and we hope you'll be back for that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes. And I just want to say also that an exciting development, and one of our principal missions here is to celebrate the art of craftsmanship, so to assist in ensuring that the unique knowledge of artisans is understood and carried forth for generations to come. And to that end, we have a lot of work to do, and I don't know if any of our artisans are here tonight, but if you are, thank you especially for coming. And I'm happy to say that just published is a book about the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen called The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, A History. But Polly Guerin, the author of this book, who wrote the Cooper Hewitt Dynasty, has done a fabulous job of describing this place where history and tradition and contemporary innovative programming lives. So it's we may be 230 years old, but we are contemporary, and we celebrate history. And I want to say, Jeff, I don't know if you know this, but you're mentioned on page 156. So congratulations to you, and thank you.